Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the session on gaining security insights through correlation. You can all hear me okay? All good? Sweet. Okay. My name's Corey Singleton. I'm part of the professional services team here at Sumo Logic. And without further ado, let's dive in. So what will you take away from today's session? We're going to talk about different correlation scenarios that you can leverage Sumo Logic for. We're going to talk about some examples that we've observed with different customers in correlation type scenarios. And then last, the bulk of this session we're going to spend on kind of a deep dive in looking at specific operators, 3 in particular, that Sumo offers, so that you can leverage and gain sort of some powerful insight out of your logs in Sumo Logic. So we'll spend the bulk of our time in a live demo. Okay. So let's see if we can move it forward here. Maybe. Let's try it this way. So what is correlation? So to just kind of level set with everyone and define correlation, it's a mutual relationship or connection between 2 or more things. If we state that differently, this is a process of establishing a relationship or connection between 2 or more measures. So to put that into context, if we start to think about relating that to the world of logs, we're trying to take things like OS logs and correlate that to maybe our endpoint protection logs, or maybe we're trying to correlate an IP address that's been flagged by our firewall to some other set of logs that's going to give us some additional insight. Okay. So why should we correlate logs? Why is this important? Why does this make sense? As many of you probably are aware, individual events alone are often not enough to concern us. So a single login failure from our OS logs, whether that's Windows events or from our Linux environment, may not be that concerning to us. When we correlate, we can start to really get some additional insight. It also provides us an additional level or higher level of confidence that we actually have an issue. We really want to try to cut through the noise so that we're not wasting our time investigating things that aren't necessarily that important. So the more information we have through correlation, the better we can be at sort of identifying real issues. We can also add critical context. So oftentimes we, again, sort of taking the example of a failed user login, we need additional information about that. What did that user do in our environment? What IP did they map to? Potentially, what was the firewall traffic? So we can start to correlate those pieces of information together. And last, but perhaps most importantly, you can maximize your query game with this. You can kind of level up. These are some very cool operators that we're going to cover. Okay. So what are some examples of correlation? So taking the example of endpoint protection, and these are just kind of a few examples that we typically see in working with various customers. Endpoint protection logs to OS logs. So as an example of this, you may have a host that's been flagged by your endpoint protection logs. What OS activity occurred for that particular host? So what was done from an OS level for that particular host? In terms of traffic logs from an intrusion detection system, we could correlate that to traffic, firewall traffic. So for a given IP from our IDS, if it was flagged, what was the traffic from an outbound perspective and to where? So that we can start to understand why that might be important. And then the last one here, which is a little bit interesting, is these correlations don't always have to be to other log sources. You can do correlations within the same log source. So taking the example of OS events, you may be interested in multiple OS events, things like a user add followed by a user delete in a short span of time, or long-running SSH sessions as an example. So these don't have to be sort of spread across disparate log sources. And these are just kind of a sampling of some of the use cases. You can probably already start to think about some of the relevant use cases for you in your own roles. This also extends beyond security use cases. So the correlation operators that I'm going to show you today kind of go beyond just security. You can use these in operational use cases as well once you kind of understand the mechanics of how they work. Okay. So let's dive into a demo. I'm not going to switch quite yet, but what do we need to correlate logs? Typically, in most scenarios, just some type of a unique identifier that links the 2 different logs together. So this typically comes in the form of things like usernames, IP addresses, session IDs, a host or a device name, just a piece of, a key essentially, a piece of information that we can use to link those 2 different logs together. So the first operator I'm going to show you and we'll kind of dive deep into is transaction. And transaction allows us to correlate logs from one or more log sources. So it can be a single log source, it can be multiple. What's the primary use case for transaction? Primary use case is checking the existence of a value, for example, an IP, across different log sources. So I want to know if a particular IP has shown up in my IDS logs as well as my OS events, or I want to know if a particular IP has shown up in my IDS logs and my web traffic. Transaction performs an outer join on the data, so we're going to get matches whether or not there's matches in every log we're trying to correlate or not. And it also aggregates the results, as you'll see here in a moment. The third thing that transaction requires is that we define states. And these states are essentially keywords or values within a field that we can use to define how we want transaction to aggregate. And that'll make a little bit more sense here in a second. So I tend to like to look at these things visually to kind of help sort of tie all these things together. So if we look at a quick visual example here, you can see at the top we have a web application firewall attack from our snort logs. So you can see we have a particular IP address here that's been flagged, so that's 78.235.3364. If we want to correlate that with our Apache access logs, perhaps to understand what was done from a web traffic perspective, that's where transaction can help us. So if we correlate that with the access logs, you can see the mechanics of the transaction operator is calling transaction on whatever field we're using to tie these two logs together. In this case, it's the source IP. We're defining some states. So I'm saying with the states labs security snort and labs Apache access in the source category field. So I'm defining these, in this case, two values within the source category field because I want to know if the same IP exists in those source categories. Okay? And so the output, you can see we get some compact output here, basically tells us that this particular IP, at this start and end time, there was a hit in our labs security snort logs, and there was also some Apache access traffic associated with that. So from here, we could do many different things with this. We could put this on a dashboard in its current form. We could schedule this as an alert if we want to be more proactively notified. So lots of different options here in terms of taking this a step further. So I'm going to jump over to a live demo now, and we'll take a look at this particular query. Cool. So what is this query doing? First thing we're doing, we're pulling in our security snort logs. So that's the first line here. I'm looking for web application logs in particular. And I'm also pulling in my Apache access logs. So I want to unify both of those two logs. We're doing some parsing. So we're pulling out the fields we care about, source IP, source port. We're also doing two different types of parsing because these IP addresses may appear in different ways in these two different logs. And then as mentioned, kind of the meat of the operation here is this line right here. So I want Sumo to group these two different logs based on the IP, link them together, and I want Sumo to tell me if I have hits in both the snort source category as well as the Apache access source category. Okay? And then the last line here is really just to filter out anything that I didn't have a hit in both. So I only want to know if I had hits in both areas. So let me expand this out a little bit, and we should be able to get some data here. Perfect. So you can see we had one hit for this particular IP. There was 700 associated access logs. So then I could begin to investigate that further if I need to. Okay. All right, I'm going to go ahead and switch back to the presentation. Next up is transactionize and merge. So transactionize and merge is distinctly different from transaction in that it's going to link the logs together in the same way that the transaction operator did. However, with transactionize, we have the option to merge the raw results. So transaction is an aggregate operation. Transactionize is going to operate on the raw logs. It's not going to aggregate them per se, but we can optionally merge those results if we want to in a single compact result. Okay. So primary use case for transactionize, linking the logs and optionally merging the raw data. Second thing is we can use the merge operator, as I said, to combine raw log messages or different extracted fields if it's not the raw log message itself. The last thing is transactionize provides some additional flexibility with advanced operators. So there's some advanced flags here. You can specify a max span, which you'll see in a moment. You can also specify when you want a transaction to start, how many logs are the max logs that can be included, as well as max pause. So there's some additional operations in there that you can pass in as flags. Okay. Now, before I go any further, I also want to point out that all of these are documented fully in our documentation. So the syntax here, the details of these specific flags, those are fully documented. So I definitely encourage you to check out the documentation as you start to play with these a little bit more. Okay. So same as before, if we look at a visual example, at the top I have a Linux user add. So kind of following the theme of I want to know if I have a user add followed by a user delete in a short span of time. We have a user add up at the top for a particular user. In this case, it looks like it's a service test account. If I want to correlate that with my user deletion event, the mechanics of that is transactionize, again, on whatever my linking field is going to be. So in this case, it's the user, but it could be really any of the other common key fields that we talked about. The max span is the one that I'm using here in this case because I have that sort of added requirement. I only want to know if these two things happened within a span of time. So in this case, I'm defining 60 minutes, but this could be really anything that you might be interested in. So you could define 30 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever your use case requires. So Sumo's going to group these logs based on the user. Once it's done that, it's going to figure out the span of time between these events, and then it's going to merge them. So notice this merge section. If I don't leverage merge, Sumo's going to correlate these things together and show me the raw data. But the reason I want to use merge is I want to get this data in kind of a compact form. So in the event that I have two usernames, I'm going to take the first one that happens, right? Because in this case, they're going to be the same user. So that's what that take first is. For process name, I want to merge those two things because I'm going to determine in this case whether it was a user add or delete. And I also want to know what time they happened. So I want to know what time was associated with each process. So I'm going to merge those as well. So that's the merge section, is taking the raw logs and merging those fields in different ways. So you can take first or you can take last, which will take the last value in the series instead of the first value. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over to a demo. And we'll take a look at this. Perfect. So if we kind of dissect this query, the first thing we're doing, we're pulling in based on source category. So I'm telling Sumo to fetch the logs that came from labs Linux secure. I'm then keying in on user adds and deletes. So I'm adding some keywords in here to hone in on the specific logs that I care about. I'm parsing out the relevant information. So I'm doing a parse regular expression. I'm also doing a parse anchor. So I'm pulling out the host name, process, as well as the user information from these. Okay. And then if we just explore that transaction operation, again, Sumo's going to take those two disparate sets of logs. In this case, we're actually correlating within the same log source, but you could certainly leverage this across log sources. We're telling Sumo to group based on the user. We only want to know if these user events happened within a span of 60 minutes. And then we're merging based on this information here. So I want to merge the user and only take the first one. I don't want to see all the distinct ones. I want to take all the process names, whether it's a user add or user delete. And then I want to merge the times as well. I want to know exactly what times those things happened. So again, from here, we got a few different options. Depending on what we're looking to do, we can add this to a dashboard. We can also schedule this as an alert if we want to be a little bit more proactive in responding to these types of things. Okay. So that's transactionize and merge. Again, merge is optional, so you don't have to use that. It's helpful if you're trying to get the results in kind of a more compact form, though. Okay. All right, so let's jump back to the presentation. So the third operator in the toolbox that we're talking about in terms of correlation is Subquery, and this one's actually pretty new. For those of you that have played with it, you know it's new. It's come out within the last couple of weeks. So Subquery allows us to take the data from a parent's query and filter that by the input of a child query. So we can take the results of one query and filter another query based on it. And so it's easiest to think of this in sort of the parent-child relationship. You have a parent query, perhaps that query is returning Apache access traffic. You have a child query, which is returning maybe IPs that have been flagged in your snort logs, and you want to sort of merge those. I only care about the Apache traffic that's been flagged by my snort logs, right? So the IPs that have been flagged by my snort logs. So just one example there. Okay. So primary use case, filter events from one log source based on the results of a query from one or more other log sources. Subquery performs an inner join, so that means we need to have a matching value in both queries in order for us to get the result. And as I mentioned, the parent and child query relationship, the cool thing about that is we can have different time ranges. So I can have a child query that's looking at the last 5 minutes, and I can have a parent query that's maybe looking at the last 24 hours. Okay. So if we look at a visual example here, just kind of putting this together, the top left box, we have our Apache access traffic. Now this is all Apache access traffic, which from a security perspective may not be that interesting. On the right, I have some IPs that have been flagged as web application firewall attacks. So in this case, I want to take those two and merge them together so that the output is essentially just the Apache access traffic for those IPs that were flagged. Okay. So then I can start to get a better sense for what is it that these IPs are doing. What URLs did they hit? What was the status code and the method that was related to those things? Okay. All right, so let's switch over to a demo. We'll take a look. I think it's easiest in the case of Subquery when you first start to play with it to build the queries separately. So if we look at an example of the parent query, I have a very simple query here. I'm pulling my labs Apache access logs. I'm counting the data by source IP, method, status code, and the URL. And you can see we have a table output of this data. Okay. Now if we jump over and we look at an example of the child query, in this case I'm looking for against my snort logs, so I'm pulling in that source category. We're filtering that with this keyword here. So I want Sumo to pull in only those snort logs that were classified as a web application attack. I'm doing some parsing of the relevant fields that I care about in this case, and then I'm counting by the source IP. So in this case, I want to take those two queries and I want to merge them together using the subquery operator. Okay. So let's take a look at what that looks like put together, and then I'll sort of come back to that child query and we'll talk about how it actually works. So notice it's very similar to the two individual queries put together. So there's a lot of similarities. So I'm still pulling in my labs Apache access. The meat of the subquery is right here. So within brackets, I'm calling the subquery operator. I'm passing in the same child query that you saw before. Right? So this child query is exactly the same as what you saw on the previous screen. The addition is this compose operator. And so what compose is doing is it's telling Sumo, take the output of that child query, compose the source IP into a filter list, and then pass that back to the parent query. Okay? So I'm telling the parent query in this case, filter to this set of source IPs. Okay? I then count by source IP, method, status code, and URL, and now I have a clean list of the Apache access traffic for only those IPs that have been flagged by my snort logs. Okay? So compose is useful in a few different ways, and you can place subqueries in a few different places in your query. Notice in this case I've placed subquery in the scope of my query in the first line, but I could also put it in a where operation. So if you're using a where clause, and that's kind of the only way that you can do the filtering, you can place subquery after a where. You can also place subquery in if statements. So if you imagine an if statement, if whatever your test condition is, you can insert a subquery inside that as well. Okay. What else can we do with subquery? We can insert a from time. So I can say from -5m. And Sumo's going to then treat that as last 5 minutes, whereas my parent query is looking at the last 15 minutes. Okay. You can do absolute time ranges, so you can do a specific date and time, or you can do a relative time like I've done here, so -5m, -5h for the last 5 hours, and so on. Okay. So that's subquery. I also want to mention with subquery, you can also do ands and ors, so you can nest these subqueries together. So I can have multiple child queries as well. So here, taking that same example a little bit further, we're taking Apache access logs and we're filtering that based on hits in our snort logs. Okay. And then I'm also saying I want to and in another subquery because I only want to know if those same IPs occurred as threat traffic from my Palo Alto logs. When those two things happen, then I want to see what the Apache access traffic was. So you can do ands and ors on multiple subqueries. You can nest them together. Okay? So that also helps sort of layer in some additional intelligence there. Okay? So in this case, I didn't happen to have any particular matches on both of those scenarios, which is a good thing. Right. And I just want to take a quick moment to point out the documentation. So you can access the documentation in Sumo if you click on Help. You go into Documentation. As I mentioned earlier, all these operators completely documented. You can read sort of more about the syntax requirements. If you need a quick refresher, you can jump in and take a look at those as well. Okay? All right, so I'm going to jump back to the slides one more time, and we're going to talk about one other thing that we can add into these queries for kind of an additional layer of intelligence. So, as you may or may not know, we've partnered with CrowdStrike to basically add in a built-in threat intelligence database that's curated by them. So any of these queries that you saw today that include things like IP addresses, domains, users, those types of things, we can bounce those fields against the threat intelligence database and get all the information that that database adds inside our query. So we can learn things like, is this particular IP associated with a known threat or malware? We can see what type of confidence CrowdStrike has assigned to those particular things. So we can add in sort of that additional layer of intelligence to be really confident that we actually have some type of an issue. Okay. So I'll show you a quick example of that, and then we'll wrap up. If you could switch back to the demo. So here's an example of a query. If we go back to the example we looked at before where we ran transaction to identify if we had snort log, a hit in our snort logs, as well as Apache access traffic. Notice we have an IP address. I can leverage the lookup operator, so we can look up various metadata fields from that threat intelligence database. So again, this can be things like the actor. Is this associated to an actor that CrowdStrike is aware of? So I'm looking up, in this case, the type, actor, the raw value, the threat level. I'm assigning that as the malicious confidence from sumo/threat/cs. And then the on statement is how you want to match that database. So if you're using your IP from your query, you can simply say on threat equals source IP. So I want to know if this source IP field has any matches in the threat intelligence database. Okay. So if I run this, in this case, we didn't get any hits from the threat intelligence database, which is a good thing. And again, we can take this information and we can set up alerts based on this. If we want to know anything that's been flagged as high malicious confidence, for example, we could even put these on dashboards if we want to visualize this on a dashboard. So lots of different options here. In terms of the threat intelligence database, it's not just IP address. That's probably the most common one, but there's other indicators of compromise that you can leverage from that database as well. Okay.
Is that very well documented, what's in that database?
Absolutely, yes. So that is also documented. If you just type threat intel in the documentation, you'll get a full set of frequently asked questions, and we document all the different fields that are available. You actually get a JSON object back from the threat intelligence database, and it documents all the different values that are there. Okay. So if I could switch back to the slides one more time. So in summary, what have we talked about today? We've talked about, in this case, how you can leverage correlation operators in Sumo to get some additional insight, to be more confident about the types of security threats that you're seeing. We've taken a look at a few different examples that we've seen from our customers in terms of the common correlation scenarios. And we also took a look as far as a deep dive into these three specific operators: transaction, which we said is useful for correlating logs and then doing some aggregation on those; transactionize, which is useful for correlating one or more sets of logs and then optionally merging the raw results. And we looked at subquery, which allows us to take the output of one query, pass that to a parent query, and filter the result. Okay. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and wrap up. I appreciate everybody's time, and I think we probably have a few minutes for questions. If there's no questions, I'm happy to talk with folks off to the side as well.
We do have about 8 minutes for some questions. Any questions from the audience? One in the back here.
Is there support or planned support for referencing a saved search for subqueries?
For referencing a saved search for subqueries? That's a good question. I'm not aware of current plans for that, but I'd be happy to chat with you on the side and we can talk with the product manager on that. Sorry.
If you could just repeat that, please, so we all hear.
Do we have training resources for correlation?
So in terms of the specific training resources for these three operators, you'll see in the documentation there's a couple of videos that sort of walk you through using them in a similar form to what I've done today. Also, if you didn't get a chance to do this security certification, that's going to be a good one because we do talk about these three operators specifically in a security context as well. So I definitely encourage you to check that out as well in terms of the training around these operators.
Nice, because I'm doing that. Okay, it's good to know
Cool.
that it's coming up.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Other
Any
questions?
others? If not, cool. Feel free to stop me. I hope to see you guys throughout the day, and thank you for your time.
Great job, Corey. Thank you.